Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this really special and unique event that School of Professional Studies at Columbia University is putting on this evening. My name is Jacob Arambell. I'm one of your hosts this evening, and I'm one of the admissions counselors here at the School of Professional Studies. Before we begin, I have a couple of comments that I wanted to say before our speakers took over. One, you'll notice there are two chat functions as a part of our Zoom room. One is the Q&A box, and the other is the chat box. Our lecturers this evening will ask you at times to participate and answer questions. If you're able to answer their questions in the chat box, they'll be able to see your answers. There's another portion of the webinar this evening that revolves around answering specific questions. If you have a question to ask one of the lecturers, please put that in the Q&A box. We'll be able to filter them through that way and provide them with our lecturers. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our Director of Postbaccalaureate Studies, Gabriela Moore.
Welcome, everyone. I don't need to tell you that these are challenging times, and we wanted to offer you an opportunity to hear from some experts, our faculty, about strategies for sifting through what has become an onslaught of news and information, particularly on social media. Today's topic is an important one, not just for businesses and leaders, but really for all of us. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, I want to reinforce for you something that Jacob has been talking about. This is, we hope, an interactive event. So you have a Q&A box at the bottom. If, as we're going along, you think of a question you'd like to ask either of our speakers or both of them, please enter that question in the Q&A box. Don't worry if you're not perfectly worded. We will let the speakers know that you have a question and pass it along to them. On the other hand, there are two different moments when one of our speakers, Ambika, will ask you to provide a quick answer to a poll, and that you can do in the chat space. So without further ado, we have two speakers today. Ambika Samarthya-Howard is a communication specialist, video producer, and writer who has created and taught at the intersection of storytelling and social good for 2 decades. She holds an MFA in filmmaking from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown. In addition, Ambika also completed a Fulbright Fellowship in Bollywood. Our second panelist is Liza Gross. Liza is a journalist and media leader with over 3 decades of experience at news organizations and nonprofits. Liza specializes in guiding the transition of traditional news outlets to multimedia platforms, as well as exploring new and transformational models for media organizations. She holds a Master's in Public Affairs from Ohio State University and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Journalism from CUNY. Both Liza and Ambika are faculty at the Business Certificate here at Columbia SPS, where they've taught communication courses in the past. And together, and we're very excited about this, they have just developed an exciting new course that is launching this fall. The course is called Navigating Facts and Communications, Truth in Today's Information Age. As you can imagine, that course, which meets over the entire semester, will delve much more deeply into topics that they will touch upon today. So I'd like to welcome both our expert panelists, and Ambika, please take it away.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Jacob. And thank you, Liza. Thank you for inviting us to do this talk today. It's an especially relevant talk, not only because of what is happening with COVID, but also the recent news around the boycott of Facebook that Columbia is joining as well. So there's a lot to talk about here. I wanted to first start off with opening up a question to everybody, which is where exactly are people getting their information on COVID? If people could just write in the chat window quickly about like where they get the information from. I won't hold anything against anybody. And it doesn't have to be one answer, it can be many answers. I'm just curious where people get their facts from. And it's definitely one of those times where A lot of us are looking for leadership. A lot of us are looking for guidance with facts. And so where are people reading? Where are people getting their truth on the virus? I'm seeing a lot of people say the New York Times, and some people are saying the New York Times Online, specifically the digital version. Anybody else? If everyone could, okay. Trusted Twitter feeds, that's really interesting. Church Health Ministry, CNN, Apple News Stories, that's a nice range and variety of information sources. I appreciate that. And you can see that some of these things are both online, some of them are actually physically things that people engage with in real time, and then other things are sort of closed groups, trusted Twitter feeds. So I appreciate that there's like a variety of both public and private, and also a variety of like what is insulated and what is special to you. You can see in the next slide that one of the things that's become very apparent with COVID is that most people today still really do get a lot of their information from social media. You can see that almost half of adults today get information from Facebook, and YouTube is quickly thereafter, and as well as Twitter. This is rapidly changing, and every year we can see that more and more people are getting their information from social media, and less people are getting their information from news sources. So I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, which is, once you get this information, where do you go to validate this information? Again, if you could please write your answers in the chat window. And I know this will take a little bit more time. So imagine you're reading something in the New York Times, or imagine you're reading something from Google or from Twitter or from a trusted feed. How do you know to trust the information? Is it automatic because it's showing up on your feed, or what actually makes you believe the information that you're reading? Where do you verify that information? Gabriel mentions that he goes to the original source, like at the video on YouTube. So he goes back to where it's actually sourced from. That's really smart, and that's a very good practice to hold. I see that this is a harder question for people to respond to. So just imagine you're reading something on New York Times, reading something in your Twitter feed. Do you verify it or validate it further? Or do you assume it's true because of the sources you're reading it from? Sometimes going to fact-checking websites like PolitiFact, which we will talk about later. I'm loving that came up in our chat window. That's usually one of the main sources of verification that I often talk about, PolitiFact. Checking with other sources, that's also really, really good practice. And if it's a reputable source, I tend to just believe it, to be honest, because I'm getting it from social media. I Google to see if there's other articles about it. So that's awesome. I'm glad that you guys are really sort of like a very educated group about how to verify. Some of the things that have come up about fact-checking websites like PolitiFact is something that Liza and I definitely talk about in our course, and we really advocate that. I love the idea of cross-checking. Generally, when you're looking for misinformation, disinformation, if you cross-check sources and cross-check across who's actually sourcing this out, that's a really good best practice. And then actually fishing for the source that is citing and to go back to the original sources, that's really important too. So I think you guys have all of that covered. So let's talk about what's actually happening in today's world between misinformation and disinformation. So just to clarify, when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, they're two very different things. Misinformation refers to inaccurate information or content that's unintentionally or mistakenly shared. So let's say that you see something and you think it's true and you spread it, but you're not trying to do any harm. You think it's funny, or you're hoping to actually spread something that is accurate and it happens to be inaccurate. That is what misinformation is. Disinformation is actually information that is deliberately created to create harm for a person or social group, and it is information that's false. The problem, and I think the importance of both this course and what we're seeing today in the media climate, is that misinformation can be a direct result of disinformation. So what's happening is that a lot of people trying to spread disinformation are doing it through misinformation. So that oftentimes when you're seeing something and you spread it and you're like, oh, I didn't know it was true, but I just tweeted it, and you don't think it's a big deal to retweet it, those people who are actually intentionally creating harm are using people like you and using your networks to spread their falsehoods. So I wanted to turn it over to Liza to share some of the most harmful examples in very recent history of our government doing something like that. Liza?
Thank you, Ambika. Thank you all for joining us today. The story of the pandemic is very fast moving, changing all the time. It's very challenging for news professionals to cover. And for consumers to understand what information is current, what information is out of date, what information can be easily checked, easily verified, what is misinformation and what is disinformation. And we've seen examples of all of these. Some with less tragic consequences than others that can cause a lot of harm. Let's say, for example, an example of misinformation with not terrible consequences would be a local news outlet offering the wrong address for a testing site, or offering the wrong times when a testing site is going to be active, or a news organization, whether local or regional or national, not being very clear about terms like antibodies or types of tests, or what is the result of taking this test or that test. So those are examples of misinformation, and they can be harmful, but not necessarily tragic. The one I am going to talk about in detail in terms of having very tragic consequences was one that was really driven by our government, specifically by the president, regarding the use of hydroxychloroquine as an effective drug to treat COVID-19. Now, this drug has been used for many years, very successfully, to treat malaria, lupus, and other conditions. And on the basis of very little evidence, for some reason, the president started pushing the use of hydroxychloroquine, both in material generated by the White House or in the press briefings that he used to give that he later suspended. The President of the United States is a very important source of news for the citizens, and it determines a lot of behaviors. And tragically, when President Trump promoted the use of hydroxychloroquine, this resulted in deaths. There was this couple that, prompted by the president, the surviving spouse specifically noted that, ingested hydroxychloroquine, which was a component in their fish food. But they had heard the president say it was a good thing. So when they read the ingredients on the bottle of their fish food and saw that it had hydroxychloroquine, they thought it would be a good idea to try it. Where the husband died, the wife was violently ill and survived, and then she later talked about how hydroxychloroquine had been specifically used by them because of what the White House had urged them to do. So disinformation can be absolutely harmful in very difficult ways. Now, the other aspect of this is sometimes it's not so much what we say, but what we omit. Also related to the hydroxychloroquine affair, then President Trump talked about the fact that he himself was taking a course of hydroxychloroquine, and that this could be verified by his physician. So if we can move on to the next slide. This is the letter that the physician produced, and it was, of course, distributed by Kelly McEnany, the communications person, the press secretary. And it was indeed authored by the president's doctor, but if you read that text very, very carefully, at no point in time it confirms the fact that the president is indeed undergoing a course of hydroxychloroquine. So when we look for disinformation and when we look for misinformation, it's not only what is said, but we need to look also for the gaps in information, for the omissions, what is not stated, which is of course sometimes as important or even more important as what is stated. Disinformation can also be spread through visuals. Many times, news media and other entities, public agencies, private agencies, businesses, corporations use visual representations, visualizations to make a point, to send a message. This was a particularly egregious example of disinformation from the state of Georgia when they wanted to press the point that the virus had not propagated so intensely in Georgia, and that Georgia for the moment was free or relatively free of infection. So the bars on the bottom, you will see the bars, the vertical axis indicates the number of people or cases. The horizontal axis indicates the date. So if you look at the date, you immediately see that there is something wrong because the bars are not organized chronologically. So it is impossible to figure out what the trend is from looking at these sites. They are at this visualization. It's conveniently organized to show what it will support the point that the state of Georgia was trying to make, which was not a truthful point. Later on in the presentation, we will see another visualization that will be very useful to see what is it that exactly was happening in Georgia at the time. But just like the gaps in information, we need to look at visualizations and graphic representations with a very critical eye to see if the information that is transmitted there is conveyed accurately, or is really just a tool to convey something that is not quite accurate. Ambika?
Thanks. So one of the reasons that misinformation spreads so rapidly is that because people actually want to believe something. And sometimes what they actually want to believe is oftentimes can be hatred, or can be tension, or really fear of other ethnic groups or fear of other religious groups. So I just wanted to spotlight the Corona Jihad tag, which went viral in India. Corona Jihad is one of the most recent manifestations of Islamophobia and disinformation. Disinformation, which is often linked to religious and ethnic conflict, has been especially prevalent in a country like India, which is very, very connected on Twitter and through social media. India has also had deep-seated resentment historically and historical strife between Muslims and Hindus. The recent government has inflicted even further pogroms in order to further abuse and kill Muslims. So that climate, that landscape was already ripe for anything to happen and just trigger people off, especially because of the population of India and the population actually on Twitter and the amount, how quickly something can go viral. Basically what I'm saying is, it's not hard to convince somebody to fear a Muslim in India, because that's a lot of people already feared Muslims. And so just putting out a tweet there makes people want to actually retweet it. It's very, very, very easy to get that viral. So what happened in early March was that the Indian authorities linked a few cases of COVID to a Muslim missionary group that held an annual conference in Delhi. By March 28th, tweets with the hashtag Corona Jihad went viral, and they already appeared 300,000 times on Twitter feeds and potentially seen by over 165 million people. So there's two very big issues with these tweets. Sometimes people just took it upon themselves to create cartoons. There's a very famous cartoon of a man named Corona Jihad, of a caricatured Muslim man trying to push a Hindu off a cliff that got retweeted 2,000 times before it was taken off by Twitter's policy. But then we also have something, and this goes back to what Liza is saying about what's being omitted. There's also this idea of context and recontextualization. A lot of what people say is fake news or fake video is actually not fake videos at all. It's the videos are real. They're just not in that context. So there's a very famous clip of a Muslim man spitting on someone in a train station that was used to really, really stir on Corona Jihad, but it actually wasn't taking place in India at all. It took place in Thailand, and there was no proof that this man was actually associated with the Delhi meeting. So that's a really great example of how people want to believe something's actually real, and they can easily latch onto different videos as proof of something because the videos are real, but the videos actually aren't proof of what's happened at all. This type of disinformation is really dangerous, and it's really horrific. And so I wanted to pause here to take any questions before we moved into the good news, which is that there are solutions, there are things, and there are people who are doing things right. So if anybody has any questions for either Liza or myself before we get into the second half of the presentation about like what is hopeful out there, I'd love to segue into that. And you can just put the questions in the Q&A window, and that would be great. I'll just give you guys about 30 seconds if you have any questions.
So Ambika, I'm seeing a question about social media. I don't know if you want to answer this now, but are there easy ways to verify the source of social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a few of the things that were highlighted when people joined this call, I think the ways that I like to make sure of things and verify things in social media is not just by my friends, and if my friends are sending it, but if I can go back to the original source and see that it's actually documented somewhere. The other thing is to actually check multiple sources. Generally, if your Twitter feed or your video is the only place this is showing up, that's not a good sign, no matter how popular you are. You really want to make sure that this video or that this data or this stat is actually showing up in multiple places, and just verify it that way. Liza, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I mean, add to what you're saying, you're absolutely correct. But also it's actually quite easy to verify the integrity of what appears on social media sites, both for images and for text. We are meeting here for only 1 hour, so I can't go into detail, but even just with the settings that Facebook provides to you, you can make adjustments there. But also there are any number of brief tutorials in the internet that have been created by schools of communication, and not only specifically for journalists, but for news consumers as well, that can teach you very quickly to understand what's the metadata around a photograph, how it has been repositioned or reframed or photoshopped, and it's actually quite easy to detect. So one of the, and we'll talk about that in our course for those of you that hopefully will be interested in attending, but it's something that as a consumer, it will take you very little time to inform yourself about and then apply it as you go through social media.
Great, thank you, Liza. So let's move on to the good stuff. So there are a lot of examples of how we can be better consumers of information and ways social media is doing good. So we'll move on to the next slide. One of the things that we can do is actually make accurate graphs. So we are seeing a slide here where everything is not clear cut. There are discrepancies. And what I really appreciate about this slide and this specific graph is that it's not just numbers. It's not just about what's going up and down. We're seeing at a very small scale, just March through July, just 2,000 cases. But that 7-day average really helps us understand how we should be reading a graph. And I think that's one of the most important things about data. It's not just about sharing data and having data, but giving data meaning. And honestly, it's really important for data visualizations that you're reading to be actually able to transfer meaning, not just facts. The next slide, I just wanted to show a really good example of a good use of Facebook. I know that Facebook owns WhatsApp, but here is what the power of Facebook and Zuckerberg could do. So I want to show this quick video, this quick PSA.
Looking for the latest coronavirus updates? Stop searching or panicking and start chatting. Just add 0600 123 456 to your contacts and start a conversation on WhatsApp with the word hi. Here you can get the latest news and tips on how to protect yourself and others through hygiene, self-isolation, and social distancing, as well as what and what not to do if you suspect you've been affected. Simply say hi to 0600 123 456 on WhatsApp.
So at the very peak of the lockdown, what we were seeing in South Africa, and we're seeing in many countries that maybe do not have access to TV, do not have access necessarily to the same level of information we were getting otherwise, is really that people were able to access this WHO, the World Health Organization's app, chatbot through WhatsApp. They had 10 million users within the first 4 days of launch worldwide, and they localized within South Africa and within about 10 countries within the first month of lockdown. One of the reasons they were able to do it is because Zuckerberg himself actually tweeted out and advertised for the app. So it is possible to use social media to actually allow for accurate information. And here's a great example of where we're saving lives through accurate information, because we can't just possibly say, oh, we just don't need the information. We know through COVID that we do. And a lot of times social media and what's happening on our mobile phones is the most accurate way to get that. If you go to the next slide, It just goes back to the PolitiFact and just about sources and how we can check sources. There's a lot of places actually that just do source checking for, like, that's all they do. The Poitner Institute has a series of resources available online that actually allow people to just check facts. And I definitely encourage any of you to use those. If you want to move to the next slide. And so this is probably, for me, one of the most both surprising and uplifting things that happened through COVID, which is that we saw organizations and platforms like YouTube and Twitter, unfortunately not so for Facebook, but YouTube and Twitter specifically started making medical misinformation policies and making it very clear that they were going to take down things that were actually not validated by the World Health Organization. Why is this so exciting to me? It's because these are the same platforms that for years I've been saying they can't do that. They don't have the algorithms of that. They don't know how to do that. They won't do that. But now, because we know that there was a direct correlation to misinformation and livelihoods, we have been able to see very accurate medical information policies like the one that YouTube has. What I'm hoping for is that while Twitter, and you can go to the next slide, while Twitter was able to take down tweets, yay, by Trump that were totally misinformation about coronavirus, I'm hoping that that also happens when we get closer to election time and other times, that other falsehoods are being propagated, that we will be able to go back to this incidence with COVID and actually point to it and say, hey, Twitter, you were able to take down Trump's tweet because it was misinformation for COVID. Take it down for misinformation for the elections. Take it down because it's misinformation of BLM and Black Lives Matter. So I think that, like, I would love for there to be a time where platforms are taking much, much more accountability towards what is happening, because now we can actually see that they are able to. So one other small piece that I wanted to, and it's just small today, but we could actually be spending a lot of time on this, is that there's actually a whole belief in this journalism called solutions journalism, that actually talks specifically about how we can actually use journalism for good, how we can talk about positive stories, counteract narratives. And since Liza does this for a living, I'm going to have her talk about it a little bit.
Well, thank you so much, Ambika. Yes, in fact, I am passionate about solutions journalism and have been for the past 6 years. I was very heartened to see, although not surprised, that a couple of the participants mentioned the word trust and the importance, the vital importance of creating a situation of trust with between the consumer, you, the citizen, the community member, and the sources of information that you avail yourself of to feel engaged and informed around what is going about what is going on around you. The solutions journalism technique focuses on not ignoring the challenge, but after identifying the challenge and describing the problem, going a step further and reporting on what is being done about it with some measure of success. What are the responses that have been validated, that have proven to be successful, that are making progress in terms of remediating the situation? It can be used on any topic and it can be done on any platform. It's a very flexible technique, but it has also been applied to the coverage of solutions journalism. I work for the Solutions Journalism Network. There we have an archive of solutions stories, and we have a vertical dedicated specifically to COVID-19 and things that are actually working, not just in the scientific side, in terms of progress regarding vaccines or masks, for example, for folks that that use sign language and are in a pickle now if they see someone wearing a mask, because how are they ever going to understand? So ingenious solutions, printing, shields for protecting the faces. So we have a number of stories there. I think that now we're up to over 1,000 in terms of COVID-19 related stories, both in the United States and abroad. But it's a matter of trust. And what solutions journalism does as a technique for the folks that consume it is it creates and stimulates that trust, because it creates an active dialogue with the reader. Solutions journalism works best at the local level. Ambika talked a lot about the social media platforms that have no geographic restriction, no time restriction, they are omnipresent. But then there's also the matter of national news. Our national news, I saw a lot of you consume the New York Times. Not that I am recommending that anyone stop consuming the New York Times, but Ambika mentioned diversifying your sources. And that is really not a bad idea. Most of us tend to go to sources that validate our own vision of the world. Sometimes it's good medicine to go to sources that have integrity in terms of their information, but may not be exactly like the Wall Street Journal, the news organizations that we would normally go to. I will confess, I force myself occasionally to watch Fox News because I am interested in seeing how they put across messages. Many of the presenters there have been incredibly guilty of very irresponsible reporting. However, some of the journalists there have been pretty good, like Chris Wallace, and they should be commended for the work they are doing, have been very combative and have called out misinformation and disinformation when they have seen it. So it's very much a matter of trust, and we're going to talk a lot about that in our course, and about how I can identify solutions journalism and look at the coverage of and find in solutions journalism a tool to understand the nuances of my context. Thank you, Ambika.
Thanks, Liza. So just to overview, we can move from illegible charts and misleading data to clear and simple data visualizations. I specifically would love for not only there to be simple data visualizations, but one that actually transfers meaning. Moving away from jargon. Jargon is like, and you could see that from the curriculum letters that Liza was showing. Even when I'm reading them, I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, this is true, but I don't even know what I'm reading. It's very easy to believe and to spread things that you can't read because you just kind of assume a lot. And you're like, okay, maybe this person knows what they're talking about. So oftentimes when you actually get to really, really simple common language is when you can get to the heart of the matter. Agreed time periods, agreed locations. This is specifically also true when we're filming and we're using video when we're on social media. It's great to have very specific times, or really specific context, a really specific idea of where, as opposed to like, this is happening everywhere, and this is all that's happening. The more specific we can get, as opposed to having vague framing, the better information is going to be for anything, whether we're not giving a business presentation or whether we're doing journalism. Anytime we are trying to communicate and convey information to someone else, whether it's your kids or whether it's your boss, the more you can actually be specific, the more effective we're going to be. Just pause before sharing. Reactive posting is one of the most harmful things you can do. And that's a very, very good step in all of what we're talking about here with information, is just like take a moment and assume things may not be true before you actually post it. To check sources instead of kind of being in your own, like, these are my 5 Twitter friends and I believe everything they say, to actually be able to kind of move away from that and to check different stuff and not be in your tunnel. That's going to be really helpful, especially with the upcoming elections and just with everything you're doing in your life. I mean, I'm surprised that Liza is watching Fox News, but I also understand why. And I think it's really important for us to really step out of our boxes. And then this leads into one of the questions that we have from Kevin about how do we address social media users who are looking for accurate information, who are not looking for accurate information. And I think that this is one of the things where platforms can really take more accountability, and platforms live off of us. So we see a platform not take accountability for the information that they're putting out, we can get off those platforms and encourage other people to boycott those platforms too. Platforms are responding to our needs. That's how they actually thrive. And so I do think that we have a lot to say about how much we can actually demand platforms to be accountable, at least in a limited term. I will say that for most of the world, I think that there's this like feeling in the States and in a lot of places where we're saying social media is bad, the social media giants are bad, let's just never use them. But in most places in the world, social media is actually the only source of like accurate information, because the only other type of information is state-run media. And so platforms don't have to be providing in misinformation. In fact, I think a lot of times when people go to social media and they engage with it, they're not doing it because they're trying to harm people. In fact, they actually believe what they're saying is true. So we can be good consumers on social media, and we can encourage other people to be good consumers. I think we're going to be doing a huge stance in terms of encouraging other people to do that. If people don't want accurate information, there's nothing you can really quite do about people who actually are looking for false information. And we know there's a lot of people out there, except to really advocate for social media platforms to take down false information when it's not verified. I just wanted to leave with the way that I get my Trump news. And so we will watch the next thing, and then we'll end there, and I'll start taking questions. So I just wanted to move on to a very, very prominent woman named Sarah Cooper, with, how I actually only can digest Trump's information. And this is a great, great way in which social media can battle social media, where we're actually seeing Trump's misinformation become really clear that it is misinformation. Now we can see that battleground by someone who's now a massive Twitter influencer and who has now been on Jimmy Kimmel and has really been spotlighted primarily because of her lip syncing of Trump.
We hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number in the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
Thank you. I always like ending with her because it makes me feel a lot more hopeful about what social media can do. Jacob had a question about responding to someone who shares with you a piece of disinformation they have a conviction of. Liza, would you like to respond to that?
What was the question again?
If someone shares with you a piece of disinformation that they truly believe in, what is a good way to battle that out?
I was just thinking about that as you were talking about the exchanges in around social media or in the social media arena. So I am so happy that someone asked that question. I feel that engaging in sterile discussions is totally useless. And it of course depends who your interlocutor is. If you are trying to have a conversation with someone that have a close relationship with, and you really genuinely want to understand that person's point of view and your point of view, then you might want to invest time there offering additional information. But really, unfortunately, and I am so sad that we saw the good uses of social media with Sarah Cooper, and now we're back to the dark sides of social media. But there is so much sterile discussion there by and misinformed statements and statements by people who otherwise could be very well informed, but just because of the fact that they are in social media and they are protected by a certain degree of anonymity, will put out there the most provocative and unproductive arguments forward, or not even arguments, just simply a statement to see how much havoc they can create. And so I would definitely not engage in any of those things. I would worry about becoming a consumer myself, a good consumer. And by being a good consumer, I am doing my part. And then I will let everybody else take on their responsibility. Unless I am a journalist, of course, when my role is a very different thing, or a communications person in my professional life in some way.
And I would be very cautious about trying to battle things out on social media, because what often happens, like let's say somebody puts something out on Twitter and you know it's false. If you start responding to that falsehood, that's actually just creating more engagement for that tweet. It just looks like they have more retweets. It looks like their stuff is really engaging, and it kind of brings in the fodder So I would say like blocking that person or getting off that person's tweet or flagging it for Twitter violations is something that I do often, or flagging things for Facebook violations. Very oftentimes when you do flag things, they will get taken off. So I would suggest that that's like the best way to do it. But I do not go down the rabbit hole of actually trying to have that fight on social media itself, because that's just going to be what that person is looking for. So I would also be really, really cautious about that. Does anybody have any other questions? Because Liza and I, we can, you know, we have a lot to talk about, so we can keep going. But if anybody has questions, we can be more specific about what we talk about.
Well, Ambika, I'm noticing that Kevin Danko is talking about the fact that he goes to Fox News first for Trump news. If it's in any way critical, which it has been lately, it's probably true. It is absolutely a fact. You're absolutely correct, Kevin, that fairly recently Fox has taken a turn. And in fact, the president has expressed his big disappointment that Fox News doesn't work for us anymore, meaning himself and his followers, prompting Neil Cavuto, another pretty good professional journalist, to say, "We don't work for you, Mr. President." So the priorities were unclear. I wouldn't suggest going to Fox News as a primary source of information, but definitely as a counterbalance, definitely to broaden my diet, definitely occasionally, definitely for specific things, but in the same way that I advise to broaden the lens of your news diet. In the same way that I advise do not stick with the New York Times only. If you're a resident of New York City, for example, the New York Times is a pretty poor source of information for what is actually happening in the city. The New York Times does not cover the city of New York. It's more of a national type of news organization, or arts and culture in a very rarefied way, but really to cover the nitty-gritty of the city. And if I am a resident of New York and I am really interested in knowing what's happening there, then the New York Times cannot be my source of news. I need to broaden that lens a little bit. And there are a number of local digital startups that are absolutely excellent, even Borough connected, like Brooklyner, for example, in Brooklyn.
There's also, I mean, the minute we start getting into international news, we are just expanding what Liza says like tenfold. There's this beautiful Washington Post article about what would have been the journalism, or what would have been the report or article that would have come out if the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd had happened in, like, let's say the Middle East, and how that would have been reported on in a different way. And it's fabulously done. Almost all international reporting is skewed heavily by politics. And so it's just important to sort of note, like, you know, the context of which people are talking about things, the history, the political relationships, the power dynamics, the sources, and all of that stuff. And I do think that local papers and local journalism is oftentimes very much the way to go for a lot of the news. In terms of just being some of the best fact checkers, to be quite honest. And so, yeah, I think I'm just gonna double what Liza says. If we don't have any more questions, I am going to hand it off to Gabriel.
Thank you, Ambika. Thank you, Ambika and Liza, Professor Gross and Professor Samarthya-Howard, for that really engaging and informative presentation. I think all of you can see that these are two professionals with broad background in journalism. Hard to cover all the territory they could cover in 45 minutes, but as we mentioned earlier, they are both going to be co-teaching a course in the fall called Navigating Truth that will be, 14 weeks of this sort of conversation. And I can tell you firsthand, because I've been in the classroom with both Liza and Ambika. They are very exciting people. They don't just lecture, they interact, they really get you thinking. So hopefully some of you will have the fortune to be in their class. Speaking of classes, I do want to pass the baton on to Jacob. Jacob is in our admissions team, and he's going to just give you a brief idea of some of the programs that we run in case you're interested in coming to Columbia SPS or just want to learn more about our offerings. Jacob?
Thanks, Gabrielle. And thank you, Liza and Ambika, for that fascinating and engaging conversation. If anyone else here is as tantalized as I am by that discussion and you're ready for more, you can get in touch with me or one of the other members of our admissions team with the information that's shown on your screen. You can contact us by this phone number, or even better, the email address, or you can view our website to see what specific programs there are. I used this little breakout bar here, this post-bac studies bar, to demonstrate what one of the menus would look like on our website, and in order to navigate through the different pieces of information. If you want to make an appointment with us, you can go down on any of the pages, use this little contact button, and it'll take you to a link. Otherwise, I have put in the chat my personal appointment link. So if you're interested in taking courses, get in touch with us. We are ecstatic and excited to work with you. If you're looking at taking classes this fall, keep in mind that July 30th is the final application deadline, and classes, we are all very excited to say, are starting on September 8th. So without any additional comments, I'm going to hand it back to Gabriel.
Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate it. That brings us almost to the conclusion of our event. Wanted to just note that we are recording tonight's program, including the slides and all the discussion that went on screen. So if you would like to revisit some points, because it was a lot to handle, or you'd like to share it with someone who couldn't make it today, you are welcome to do that. So you'll be getting this recording via email in a few days. Remember again, if you're interested in learning more about the programs we offer at Columbia SPS, Jacob, who just spoke, and his colleagues at admissions, they are knowledgeable and they are trained to help people figure out what the best fit is for them at Columbia. And we have a wide variety of programs. Fortunately, many of them are very flexible. Classes can be taken online or in person. They can be a mix of those two, evenings and so forth. But again, I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank you for the questions. Thank you again to Ambika Samarthya-Howard and Liza Gross for doing this for us today, and wish you all a good night.